Hi, Amanda. Lovely to be here. My name is Shayoni Lynn. I am CEO and founder of an advisory called Lynn. We're a behavioral science communications advisory. I am a StratComs practitioner. I'm a fellow of the CIPR and the PRCA. I'm also an applied behavioral scientist. And in 2021 at Lynn, we founded the Misinformation Cell, which was the UK's first commercial counter disinformation unit for public relations and communications. So it's an absolute pleasure to be here with you today. Yeah, actually. So this briefing that we published earlier this year on the disinformation and the protests surrounding the Henry Nowak incident was actually the second briefing of its type that we've published at the Misinformation Cell. So in 2024, when the Southport riots were in swing, we ran a rapid piece of research and also produced another briefing called How Hate Spreads. That's also available on our website. Again, a free resource for the industry. And following on from the insights that we found in 2024, we thought it would be useful to look at the information environment surrounding the narratives, the false narratives that were being used during the case, the very tragic case of Henry Nowak. What we found, I think, that was most interesting, especially in comparison to our insights from 2024, was there wasn't one misinformation narrative. Now, I'm sure your listeners will remember earlier this year when this was all happening, the key narrative that seemed to surface was around two-tier policing. But actually, what we found was that there were multiple and sometimes competing narratives around this particular event. And this is something that we've seen happen over and over again when such critical issues take place, such incidents take place, and also how different audiences use these different narratives to make sense of what happens around them. So, for example, obviously, we know that two-tier policing was a key narrative that was used during the protests surrounding Henry Nowak's murder earlier this year. Well, the tragic murder was last year, but the proceedings and the judgments that were passed earlier this year. But we also found, alongside two-tier policing, we found narratives around police corruption and cover-up, false officer identification. We also found narratives surrounding identity threats. So, talking about migration and civilizational decline, narratives around religious grievances, and of course, anti-woke and anti-left framings. We found narratives that demonstrated symbolic reframing. So in this case, for example, some narratives attempted to symbolically reframe this case through comparison to the murder of George Floyd. And we also found a lot of conspiracies. So what I think that demonstrates is that what connected many of those narratives was something deeper. And that's the existing beliefs that our citizens, our population have about the institutions, policing, immigration, fairness in this country. And narratives were questioning whether official information could be trusted. Now that matters because when we come to correcting these types of false narratives, especially when we work in public relations and communications, correcting these individual false claims will not necessarily address those deep-seated beliefs that form people's identities and worldviews, right? Because it's those beliefs that make these claims plausible in the first place. And I think the case also showed how quickly the boundaries between social media, political commentary, coverage, and also AI-generated information can quickly blur. And what we saw was that claims are pieces of information, how claims were moving between different parts of the information environment and was gaining salience or legitimacy very quickly as they were doing this. So for me, the case reinforced that, and this is something I've been saying since we started the cell, that misinformation isn't a content problem. To be able to truly understand the challenge arising from misinformation as a systemic risk, we need to understand how false narratives influence beliefs, how they're contributing to trust, and what they're doing, what these narratives are doing to influence audience behavior. So that's fundamentally important. I would also mention is that this case and the fact that we saw these multiple narratives gaining speed at the same time demonstrates it's a really good example of epistemic polarization. Now, epistemic polarization is when people no longer just disagree about opinions or values, right? They increasingly are starting to disagree about what is actually true, which sources are trustworthy, and how evidence should be judged. And that's really, really important for us as communicators to understand. Algorithms are personalizing exposure based on prior behavior of their audiences. Engagement metrics are rewarding content that provokes reaction, typically outrage. The system of the information environment that we work within, they're learning from the success of content that's been provocative and created negative emotion because that's more engaging. And then there's a lot of incentives that are in the mix. They're encouraging creators and publishers to frame issues in more conflict-heavy ways. Not to forget, of course, what this means in terms of the filter bubble dynamics, because that narrows cross-cutting exposure for audiences. And then finally, if you think about attention scarcity, which means people are often relying on shortcuts, mental shortcuts, to make their decision, things like familiarity, emotion, identity, all of this influences how people look at information. And so what we're now dealing with, and I don't think we talk about this enough, is this concept of epistemic polarization, because where we're trying to build trust and reduce risk and protect our organizations and our audiences, how do we do that when people no longer believe what is true? They no longer disagree about opinions or values. They're disagreeing about what is actually true. Who do we trust and how do we judge this evidence? So the Henry Nowak case, I think, is a really good illustration of how incidents like this are increasingly unfolding. So on one hand, you have a very tragic case of this young man being killed, officers failing to recognize the seriousness of his injuries, extremely tragic, and we can learn a lot from that. But at the same time, we have a different conversation that's unfolding in public, right? And this is pulling on existing narratives to create further tension and further polarization. So, whether it's narratives around two-tier policing or whether it's narratives around migration and civilizational decline, media suppression or institutional bias, these narratives, they're not new to this case. But cases like this and others give these narratives renewed visibility and also the emotional charge to spread that they need to spread. So when we look at the behavioral evidence, the behavioral science evidence, it is consistent with what we have repeatedly seen in recent years. So false information, false narratives, disinformation, they travel much faster than corrections. And so when narratives tend to work, whether that's narratives by good actors or by bad actors, they're typically narratives that are based on identity-based framings. So really appealing to individuals' beliefs, their identities and worldviews is an increasingly effective way of getting them to pay attention to what you're trying to say. And not just pay attention to what you're saying, but to, in some cases, even act on the calls to action that you issue. Once a case becomes entangled with social identity, what we find and what the behavioral science research clearly demonstrates is that audiences process information in ways that protect their identity. And once those beliefs start to harden, any later information, and this could be the fact checking that we do down the line, though that information is being filtered through the beliefs and identities that audiences already hold, right? I think what colleagues can also learn from this particular incident is how different strands of misinformation create different risks. So if you think about this particular case, the originating false account from the perpetrator, it shaped the first moments of police response, right? And the two-tier policing narrative, it compressed a very complex incident into an already familiar grievance. Now, we did hear this narrative, two-tier policing, also back in 2024, and we can track it back even further. And there are a few other, narratives that kind of demonstrate the complexity of the information environment when we go through incidents like this. What we need to understand as communicators is that these are not the same problem, and we shouldn't treat them as the same problem. So for communicators, understanding which narrative is driving which behavior, which belief or emotional response, I think should be the starting point for any credible intervention. I think it's really important. I think, the first thing is it on your risk register? Last year when I did a lot of public speaking on misinformation, and, the question was asked, I asked the question, how many of you have misinformation or false narratives, risks arising as a result of false narratives? So what we call narrative risk on your risk register. And I would say maybe 2 hands went up. So I think first thing, get on your risk register, because especially if you're working in policing and emergency services, this is something that's not going away. It's getting more sophisticated, it's getting, slicker, and it's really not just an reputational and organizational issue to consider, but I think we have a duty of care towards our audiences. Like, how do we protect our audiences from these manipulative techniques and tactics? And what can we as communicators and the wider organization do to build resilience? So I would say build narrative risk into your planning. When you're thinking about sensitive announcements, crisis, emerging issues, really consider the landscape. What are the existing grievances or beliefs that could become part of the narrative? Just let's not look at traditional crisis planning. We have to start thinking about the information environment and what that means for our response. I also think that it's important to agree thresholds for interventions when we are under pressure. I think that's really important. So what justifies the intervention? Because when I talk to colleagues and clients about, especially those who've come under pressure in the information environment, typically it's a very responsive reaction. So they fall what we call in the response trap, which is either kind of try to debunk everything or, stay silent. I mean, both of those two ends of the pendulum, they're both critically dangerous. So, decide what would justify intervention. When do you intervene? Is it a behavioral risk? Is it particular audiences being exposed? Is it the potential harm? Are there operational consequences? So it's really important to establish those thresholds, I think, especially when you're under pressure. I think it's also really important to know what you do not know about your audiences. I think that's fundamental, right? So let's stop assuming broad institutional trust is evenly distributed, right? So we need to think about audience research and listening outside of this institutional bubble, and really think about the volatile and contested information environment. I talked about epistemic polarization. Think about the information environment and the different entry points that our audiences have into it and the ways in which they're exposed. So I think that's quite important. And I'd say finally, how do we measure beyond communications metrics? So if our risks are around trust and confidence, behavior, impressions and engagement is not going to help us understand whether response works. So how do we set evaluation into a program from the very outset? What do we measure? How do we consistently attribute? And how do we ensure that the narrative around measuring outcomes is all about kind of actually demonstrating what we're trying to protect or change? So I would say those are my broad tips. And I think, in conclusion, one of the key takeaways I'd like your listeners and viewers to take away from this is about online harm and how quickly it can transform into real world harm. So when we look at misinformation incidents, reputational damage is just one risk, right? But if you look at the research into online disinhibition, it clearly suggests the emotionally charged digital environments can reduce restraint, especially when people believe that they're acting in defense of a moral cause. And again, we connect that back to belief systems and identities. So I think for communications teams, we increasingly need to think beyond our traditional methods of response, so even media response. And we need to perhaps even look into, what are the safeguarding implications and how do we consider these early? Especially in the Henry Nowak case, for example, that case of false identification or doxing. These are real important spillovers from false narratives that we need to start preparing for, so we are proactive about some of this stuff as opposed to being reactive.